A lifeless body floats in a stormy sea and is miraculously rescued. The lucky survivor has 2 gunshot wounds in his back and can't remember a thing. It's the start of a captivating search for identity in the form of an action spy thriller. The fascinating story of a wanted secret agent constantly on the run, who can't trust a soul, especially not the CIA. Jason began as a character in a series of best-selling spy novels from the 1980s. A character who, thanks to the cinema and Matt Damon, has since become the hero of a global franchise. After 13 novels, 4 films and a spin-off, Bourne has become a pop culture icon and a genuine symbol of post-9/11 America grappling with redemption.
Je me souviens. Je me souviens de tout.
Te souvenir de tout ne veut pas dire que tu sais tout.
S'il ne venait pas pour nous, s'il avait d'autres projets.
The last opus to hit theaters in the summer of 2016 was called simply Jason Bourne. A name that is now a brand embodying a new version of hyped-up realistic action movie shot with a shaky cam. The name of the amnesiac everyone remembers. The character was created in the 1980s in the midst of the Cold War, when rivalry between the KGB and CIA was in full swing, but has transformed over the eras, and today finds himself at the center of conspiracy theories. But although Jason Bourne has evolved, he is still, more than any other pop culture icon, synonymous with paranoia. Behind Jason Bourne lies a somewhat larger-than-life New York writer who was quite eccentric. Robert Ludlum was a man of 1,000 lives. After World War II, the former Marine became a stage actor and director throughout the 50s and 60s. Beige trench coat, cigarette and glass of scotch always at hand. At first glance, Robert Ludlum seemed the perfect parody of a secret agent.
Oh, he was very charismatic. He had, earlier in his life, he had been an actor. So he had that actor bravado about him.
He was fairly large, when I mean tall and kind of, but he had a really commanding presence. There's a lot of, every stage actor has a commanding presence. You can't be a stage actor unless you have that. So he sort of, you know, filled the room. He had a deep, booming voice, very kind of, you know, kind of theatrical voice. Bob liked wearing that trench coat. I mean, that was his signature photo. It was, I guess, a Burberry, maybe, you know, a very traditional English trench coat.
He drank a lot. I think it helped him. I mean, you know, he was stimulated by it. And he was not, you know, I mean, he and I have gotten very drunk together, both in the evening and at lunchtime.
At his wife's suggestion, in the late 60s, Ludlum began writing a novel. He was already 40 years old. The manuscript found its way to the desk of Richard Marek, a New York editor.
I mean, he wanted to write, and so he just poured out this material. I don't think he had any formal training. I don't think he had any formal reading. I think he just sat down and typed. The manuscript was almost 2,000 pages long. Much, much, much too long. Most of the work on the Scarlatti inheritance consisted of cutting it, just cutting it. Boop, boop, page after page.
The Scarlatti Inheritance was a thriller novel situated in pre-World War II Nazi Germany. Despite 2 long years of laborious rewriting, Ludlum was convinced he had a bestseller.
He was willing to learn, and he really wanted this book to come out and to be a success. He kept saying, I wish the New York Times would review my books.
In 1971, the New York Times didn't even notice the book, but the public loved it. The book was a bestseller, and a successful author was born. From then on, Ludlum penned a bestseller every year. His trademark? Heroes embroiled in an atmosphere of Cold War and murky plots. Ludlum was in tune with the political changes his country was undergoing, starting with the assassination of JFK 10 years earlier in '63.
Everything changed in the United States. Everything. We lost our innocence. To say that 9/11 we lost our innocence, no, we lost our innocence when JFK was shot, because that was the start of the conspiracy theories that were rampant all over the place.
Then, in 1974, the scandal of Watergate and Richard Nixon's resignation caused an electroshock among the American population. Stupefied to learn their administration used the CIA for all sorts of unmentionable missions.
People realized it also targeted American citizens. For example, in the Nixon era, the CIA was used to keep an eye on activists, and people like John Lennon or Jane Fonda, simply because they spoke out against U.S. activities abroad. The CIA monitored the mail of many American citizens. It was a real turnaround. And after the 1970s, the CIA never really recovered the innocence it enjoyed in the 1950s and 60s, when it was perceived as an instrument for the defense of the free world.
So we're in the middle of some social change that is going to have an effect on the kind of fiction that Robert Ludlum wrote about.
It may have been an era of suspicion, but Ludlum, in his novels as well as his private life, proved downright paranoid.
Bob, he was a conspiracy theorist. He was deeply suspicious about any kind of cabal or groups getting together.
Robert Ludlum was a product of the Cold War. And I think at the time, spycraft was different back then. It was before the age of technology and computers. So I think at the time, for his generation, this was the norm. It was the Cold War era, there were spies. It was more prevalent, and it was more individuals than technological as it is today. So I think he definitely believed that the world was the way he wrote about it.
Robert Ludlum was always mysterious about his sources, yet his books are highly documented, accurate, and realistic. So much so that interviewers often asked if he wasn't a secret agent himself. In 1979, this paranoid, unconventional author set to work on his 12th novel. For the first time, he came up with a story in which the CIA is depicted as a den of disturbed agents with dubious methods. The story? Jason Bourne, a spy found seriously wounded and with memory loss. Once he's back on his feet and tries to find out who he really is, he finds himself up against a number of adversaries, and notably the CIA, that hunts him throughout the world as an external enemy.
What's interesting about Ludlum is a generalized moral ambiguity. It's not like in World War II novels, where you've got the good guys and the bad guys. Here, there is moral ambiguity, where even the good guys have a dark side, and you have to be wary of them.
To lend truthfulness to his storytelling, Ludlum would pick up on the tiniest details in photos from his vacations with his wife. He'd gather information like a journalist and investigate with a preciseness that could be extreme.
There was one time, I think, when he was writing something about Amsterdam, and he needed to know how many steps up or down to the main railroad station. And he didn't know, so we called the Dutch publisher, and they sent some secretary to the station to count the stairs. But it was just, you know, having the ability to be as accurate as possible.
In February 1980, the Bourne identity immediately shot to the top of the bestseller list.
We all realized fairly quickly, once the letters began to arrive, that people were looking at this book in a different way.
2 months later, 300,000 copies had flown off the shelves in the US. By the end of the year, it was the #2 top-selling novel in the country. It would stay on the bestseller list for 95 consecutive weeks.
We stopped counting years ago, but my recollection is we sold maybe 3.5 million copies of The Bourne Identity in its first year. Second year, paperback, book club, foreign editions.
Jason Bourne returned in 1987 with a second novel, The Bourne Supremacy. Then again in 1990, The Bourne Ultimatum. From then on, the saga had changed the name of the game. Little by little, intelligence agencies were becoming inevitable elements of American pop culture. In the decade that followed, movies and television seized on this, like in Enemy of the State with Will Smith, or else J.J. Abrams' series, Alias. These works portrayed ambiguous agents with often dubious morals, like the cult character from The X-Files, the cigarette-smoking man.
All of a sudden, these rather ambiguous topics and conspiracy theories are going to get passed by the X-Files. They may be harebrained ideas, but nevertheless they're part of America's pop culture. It's Fantasyland, it's creative DNA.
The CIA, I think, for writers, not for people who, I mean, its business is deadly serious, and we don't know a quarter of the things that it does. But for a writer, it's a wonderful thing because it's mysterious. The CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, terrific stuff. And everybody's, you know, must be a member of the CIA, at least according to many writers.
In the 90s, the CIA was everywhere. But like the fantastical plot lines of The X-Files, it gradually became diluted in fiction, losing the realistic intensity of Ludlum's novels. The last novel featuring his hero, Bourne, was published in 1990, but since the end of the Cold War, he was already feeling a little outdated. Jason Bourne, soon to be forgotten? Not for everyone. In 1996, a 30-year-old filmmaker and native of New York, Doug Liman, had just made a splash with his first film, Swingers, an independent comedy. On the heels of his success, Hollywood bigwigs were eagerly lining up to meet him and produce his next film. Before heading out west, Doug Liman grabbed a book off his shelf to keep him company on the trip.
I live in New York. I'm going to LA. It's a long flight, and I was looking for a book to read, and I just decided to reread The Bourne Identity just to pass the time on the flight. So I went around town saying, well, I want to make The Bourne Identity. And everybody said, well, what else do you want to make? And I was like, no, I want to make The Bourne Identity. And they're like, well, you made this little comedy. Like, we want to talk to you about making another comedy, not an action movie. And I'm like, well, I want to talk about The Bourne Identity.
Actually, Doug Liman was fascinated by Bourne's adventures because he himself had been steeped in some very real government scandals ever since childhood. His father, Arthur Liman, was a New York lawyer who notably led the investigations into Irangate, the scandal that tarnished Ronald Reagan's presidency in '86.
And I had been by his side for much of that investigation and had really come to see how things work inside the US government in terms of the spy agencies. And I thought, you know, I'm going to tell that story.
Doug Liman obstinately set off for Montana, where, nestled in the mountains amid forests and wild rivers, Robert Ludlum now lived, far from the hustle and bustle of the city.
From his point of view, it was a very dramatic arrival. And I asked him for permission to turn his book into a movie. And he said yes. It's one of those things where, like, you know, sometimes you just got to ask. Like, it seemed crazy that this massive novelist would say yes to somebody like me who had, you know, one little film under their belt.
But the young filmmaker didn't stop there. He stayed a few days longer and suggested to Ludlum they put their heads together to write the screenplay and modernize the plot.
I actually sat down with Robert Ludlum, just the two of us, in his house after I'd gotten the rights, and said, you know, okay, I'm gonna come up with a new story now. And Robert Ludlum said, and I said, I'd love your help. I'd love the brain that came up with the Bourne identity, I'd love you to come up with what it's gonna look like today. And Ludlum said to me, you know, the Cold War's not over. They want you to believe it's over, it's not over. Suddenly it was becoming very Ludlum-esque. It's sort of, you saw the brain that created these complex and twisty worlds of his novels was coming into play when I really wanted to simplify it. So it became obvious right then and there that Ludlum wasn't going to be of any help.
Back in New York, Doug Liman, along with screenwriter Tony Gilroy, completely overhauled the book's plot. Universal Pictures jumped on board and cast actor Matt Damon in the role of the spy.
Really, he modernized Jason Bourne as if Ludlum was writing about him in present day, rather than try and take the same, you know, the same exact storyline that played in the 1980s.
Avancez! Là, attendez. Non, ça doit être plus près de la fin.
In the film, paranoia is the name of the game. Geolocalization, telephones, cameras, they're everywhere.
The great idea in this first trilogy was to drop a spy into this world of surveillance and over-surveillance of the internet era.
It's a distinctly technological context, a situation where the CIA monitors the entire world and carries out missions that aren't exactly praiseworthy.
Putting the surveillance and those elements into the Bourne identity, before it was sort of publicly known, I knew about that because of my father's work in Washington, D.C. And, you know, the thing I really took from my father's work was real spycraft is really interesting.
Slated for release in September 2001, the film was stopped short in its tracks. As the world grappled with the shock of the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center, the film's release was put on hold for several months. In October 2001, George Bush ratified the Patriot Act, an anti-terrorist measure authorizing security services to access computer data concerning individuals or businesses. It wasn't until a year later, in November 2002, that the Bourne identity appeared in theaters, strangely echoing the New World Order.
With the closed-circuit TV cameras all over in cities, the eyes in the sky, the monitoring of people's movements in and out of airports, train terminals, bus stations, all of those things started happening after 9/11.
There was an awareness that the world, at least the American world, had changed, and it couldn't be filmed like before. The enemy had to be considered differently. There was a before and an after in the US, but also obviously on screen. Before, with the Cold War, it was simple. You had a few double agents you'd exchange in Berlin. I'll give you this one, you give me that one. But suddenly, the US was saying they can get us from the inside. The enemy isn't on the other side of the wall, the enemy is right here among us.
The film was a huge hit, raking in an unexpected $214 million worldwide. Universal launched the adaptation of the sequel, The Bourne Supremacy, in 2004. This time, British filmmaker Paul Greengrass was at the helm, but the saga continued to take the world by storm. The Bourne Ultimatum appeared in 2007 and once more in the summer of 2016. Jason Bourne was back on screen.
Je me souviens. Je me souviens de tout.
Once again, the saga puts itself right at the center of current events and takes on today's burning issues.
Bourne had adapted to a world that is totally connected, to our current era where conspiracy theorists 2.0 run rampant on the net. And in a surprising echo of reality, the film also refers to the trend of whistleblowers like Edward Snowden.
On a été piraté. Peut-être pire que Snowden. On a une reconnaissance faciale. Bon sang, c'est Jason Bourne.
Edward Snowden mirrors Jason Bourne, or vice versa. Like Jason Bourne, the former CIA computer analyst is wanted throughout the world. Some say he's a hero, but others see him as a traitor who revealed state secrets. Striking proof of the modernity of Jason Bourne, the ambiguous anti-establishment spy created 35 years earlier.
Snowden's young and rebellious, and so running around Eastern Europe, running around Russia, and smart, right? One thing I say about Snowden is he's a smart guy, and Jason Bourne, that was something that I always said his superpower is his intelligence. So I actually like that people would compare the two. That makes me feel good about the character we created.
Il y a une manifestation devant le siège du Parlement grec.
They're just stories, which are action movies, and undeniably intelligent ones, that talk about today's issues. So obviously, he couldn't ignore everything that's going on with WikiLeaks, the Panama Papers, and so on.
A powerful pop icon, Jason Bourne is able to adapt, without aging in the least, to the fears of the eras he crosses. Today, he reappears in a stifling period where conspiracy theories are more widespread than ever. But besides the embodiment of paranoia, Jason Bourne is first and foremost a spy, though a spy suffering memory loss, who has forgotten nearly everything. An exceptionally gifted secret agent with highly developed physical abilities, but also a human being, emotional, lost, a man who no longer knows who he is.
But what a terrific idea to have somebody, a great agent, who is quite different from an innocent, naive. A great agent who doesn't remember how he got to be an agent or what he's doing, why he's in a particular place. It's a terrific idea. Terrific for the reader. Because you're always turning the page saying, when is he going to remember? And that adds a kind of suspense that's built in. You don't have to do anything about it. You just keep going.
He says, how can I go home if I don't know who I am? And then suddenly, you're with him for the whole journey. So it became clear to me in that moment, the amnesia is sort of off-putting. That doesn't make, because we don't have amnesia, and we don't know people with amnesia. But everybody can relate to being a lost child.
In the first pages of the Bourne identity, we discover Jason Bourne left for dead in a dark and stormy sea. It's the only scene from the novel to appear identically in the film 15 years later.
Water is a medium of birth, amniotic fluid and so on. Often in novels, comics or films, when the protagonist is born like that, emerging from water, it's a very powerful act of birth. And here the water is murky. It's night, so symbolically speaking, the birth of Jason Bourne, or rather his rebirth without a memory, is very, very dark. It prefigures what lies ahead.
But it certainly makes sense to me that he used Bourne almost as a, you know, when he's floating in the water, it's almost like a, in a way, it's a Christ-like figure. He's floating in the water like this, and he's picked up. So he's, in a sense, he's starting his life anew, but always looking backwards.
This symbolic birth of the protagonist can be read in his name. Obviously, in Bourne, we hear Bourne.
Between Bourne and Bourne, there's a parallel we French speakers don't perceive, but which is present in the original English version. The character's name clearly contains the catalyst of his rebirth.
We see this idea again, somewhat by chance, in the Franco-Belgian graphic novel 13, published in 1984, 3 years after the Bourne identity. Though the authors deny the connection, the story starts out pretty much the same way. A spy found in the water with amnesia and caught up in a conspiracy. Ludlum liked to tell how his own inspiration came from his experience fighting in World War II. In reality, the story isn't quite so epic.
When he was still in New York City, he was walking around the city, and for some reason, and it was never clear why, he lost about 2 hours of time. It was 2 o'clock, and then the next thing he remembers, it was 4 o'clock. Not exactly, though, but, you know, more or less 2 hours. And he was really kind of stunned, and he called his agent, Henry.
My recollection is Ludlum liked to drink. And I think there was a time when he had a little too much, and he simply could not remember what happened to him for 3-4 hours a day. And then he sort of woke up, and he knew who he was or where he was and so forth, but he had this blank spot.
And he said, you know, I've been thinking about it, and I've been thinking that it might make a great idea for a character to have lost his memory.
A whiskey-fueled find that turned into a stroke of screenplay genius. Jason Bourne can't remember his family, where he came from, or even his friends and lovers. Amnesia literally provides the viewer or reader with a blank slate.
You take a protagonist, you erase his memory, and turn him into a kind of empty shell so the viewer can easily enter and follow the story with passion and enthusiasm. Obviously, he's the protagonist and goes from one surprise to the next. It's an incredible fictional promise.
The amnesia allows the viewer and reader to accompany Jason Bourne as he searches for his identity. We have the same information as him, whereas usually the spy hero already knows everything, and we come in afterwards and try to integrate the information. Here we learn things at the same time as him, which makes us extremely close to him.
His whole search is finding out who he really is. Who am I in this world? And how many people have not said that in their lifetime? Who am I? What am I doing here? Why am I here? And I mean, that's a kind of a universal a fascination of people, and that's what that book was all about.
In the film, we sometimes feel we're in a suspenseful session of psychoanalysis, like this famous scene that hovers between Freud and Sherlock Holmes.
Il y a 6 voitures garées sur le parking. Je peux te filer leurs numéros sans les regarder. C'est une gauchère qui est venue nous servir. Et le gars sur le tabouret au comptoir a déjà sifflé 2 verres, pèse 112 kilos et sait se défendre. Comment je peux savoir tout ça? Sans savoir qui je suis.
There are certain moments in the outline that were sort of a bedrock for me. And I was like, that's a defining moment for the character. And one of the things we came up with was this moment in the cafe with Marie. And there were just certain moments, or, where he tells her she's the only person he knows. And, you only need a few moments, or I only need a few moments like that, and I can sort of build the whole movie out from that.
Although in real life, a loss of memory such as this is often quite brief, Bourne's amnesia is quite realistic all the same. Sebastian Diguez is a researcher in cognitive neuroscience at the University of Fribourg.
Very brief spells of amnesia such as this are what we call transient ischemic attacks. In short, for some reason, less blood reaches the brain. This leads to a rather spectacular loss of memory. People can be with their friends and not know what they're doing there or who those people are. We saw it once at the hospital with someone celebrating their birthday. It was brought on by emotion. The guy was among his friends who were singing happy birthday, and suddenly he had no idea what he was doing there or who those people were. He panicked.
For all that, most of the time, amnesiacs retain certain memories. Like Jason Bourne, who can't remember where he came from, but remembers his native language, or else simple everyday actions like how to open a door. It's what we call semantic memory.
There's a whole register of memories that are a sort of mental dictionary. That's all your general knowledge. Capital cities, geographical information, the names of animals. Those are automatic, recorded memories. For instance, you can't recall the moment you learned that tigers have stripes or Paris is the capital of France. Most people don't remember where that information came from, yet they've got it. That's often conserved during amnesia.
Over the course of the trilogy, the viewer learns Jason Bourne is a super agent who has undergone experimental training and neurological programming that has bestowed him with extraordinary skills. Unsettling abilities pop out of nowhere, like in this scene where he suddenly starts speaking German.
Zeigen Sie mir Ihren Ausweis.
I don't have any papers. I lost meine Papiere. Ich habe sie verloren.
Genug. Stehen Sie jetzt auf.
And his body seems to act all on its own, with perfect mastery of Krav Maga, a rather efficient martial art.
He's so stunned by his own abilities that you feel that with him. I mean, it's a visceral shock when he tells you that, when you become aware of that.
That's another kind of memory called procedural memory, relating to everything that takes effort to learn. How to play an instrument, make a certain dish, drive a car, ride a bike. It's hard at first, but it ends up becoming automatic, like second nature.
Spy talents that, at the end of the trilogy, reveal a dark past. Before losing his memory, Jason Bourne was a human killing machine used by the CIA for illegal missions.
Mentally, it's a problem because every time he's good at killing somebody, since he told us when he can figure out what he's good at, he'll know who he is. If he kills somebody easily, that's an uh-oh moment of like, oh my God, who am I? This is not looking good.
That's the genius of the Bourne identity. All of a sudden, the protagonist is a lot darker. Doesn't know if he's a real jerk or a pure-hearted hero. Somehow, this fundamental doubt is captivating because we don't know if the hero we're attached to is a good guy or a bad guy.
In a certain way, this hero faced with an inadmissible past, who regularly flees civilization to take refuge in nature, embodies one of American cinema's favorite themes.
It's the theme of the second chance, the theme of redemption. Suddenly, the character of Jason Bourne is given the possibility to wipe the slate clean and have a new life, to be washed from all of his sins. That's another one of the protagonist's draws. It's in his DNA. He wants to be reborn. He wants redemption. I wipe the slate clean and I'm a different man. I start over from scratch.
The case of Jason Bourne can be seen as a metaphor for young Americans today who learn about the horrors their parents or grandparents were capable of in the name of defending the free world during the Cold War, and who say, that's terrible. We can't do that anymore. It's a new, innocent approach. Oh, wow. We did horrible things in the name of democracy and defending the United States. That's wrong. We have to change things.
Jason Bourne's memory loss gave his scriptwriters a fabulous tool for increasing the complexity of his character as his story progressed. It also allowed Doug Liman to take bold formal risks that profoundly changed the genre.
The amnesia allows me to do an action movie that's actually smart and honest. Because of the device, he can be plunged into an unfamiliar world and actually be technically good at it. So I started from a place. That's what amnesia gave me, was the ability to operate with a level of realism that you would not normally see in an action movie.
Jason Bourne left a definitive mark on pop culture by renewing the codes of a genre, the action movie. Before, actors in action movies looked more like this. Muscle-bound human killing machines, the archetype of the invisible, totally automated man.
We're full on in the midst of the Reagan era. It's superheroes, the action man, the indestructible hero. And who were the stars at that time? Schwarzenegger, Stallone.
In the late 90s, the choice of Matt Damon to embody the CIA's human killing machine on screen was surprising, to say the least. The young actor, who hadn't even turned 30 yet, represented pretty much the opposite of an action film. He was cast against type.
For sure, I wanted to break the role and the model of who would be the star of a movie like this. You know, this whole movie, the Bourne was sort of conceived to sort of rebel. For me, it was a rebellion against all the other action movies that were out there on every level. So it wasn't just doing the action different than the way other people were doing it. It was not casting a muscly kind of guy, but casting somebody who, I cast him from the movie he did with Gus Van Sant, you know, and I was like, oh, he had an intelligence behind his eyes, and I was like, I want that to be my superhero. I don't want a musclehead to be my superhero.
You take an actor who's got art house cinema written all over him and offer him what on paper is a pure action movie. I think the idea was to run against the action films of before. Anti-Schwarzenegger, anti-Bruce Willis, anti-James Bond, anti-all that.
Matt Damon, an actor typecast as the good guy, is the epitome of Mr. Everyman.
Physically speaking, Matt Damon is the average American in all his glory. He's the boy next door with absolutely nothing to hide. Turning Matt Damon into someone filled with secrets was pretty unusual. It was a bold move, and it worked because the character acquired a kind of shadow, a turmoil.
He embodied every man because he can pass in a crowd, he can put on a minimum amount of prosthetics and makeup and look different, and I think that's a tremendous, tremendous help.
But this everyman is endowed with almost superhuman powers. Jason Bourne has robotic reflexes. He can do anything. Analyze a complex situation instantaneously, fight barehanded, and even leap from 5 stories up without hurting himself.
And here was a chance to take a regular person and plunge them into a world of spycraft and not have it be fake that they actually know how to use a gun or a weapon or their hands and fight. So it allowed me to do a fish out of water in the spy world that actually has a level of honesty that ended up purveying not just the character, but it pervades the whole movie. It sets a tone for the whole movie.
To make his nearly superhuman abilities credible, screenwriters came up with a secret CIA program, Treadstone, an assassin unit that creates sleeper agents by secretly training them to be activated into killing machines.
The character was programmed without knowing it. And people obviously like this robotic aspect because we're human, we're flesh and blood. And all of a sudden, there are these robotic, pre-established reflexes.
It's funny because it's a cross between Terminator and Sherlock Holmes. Terminator is there, and Sherlock Holmes is, aha, you've got a speck of paint there. Your neighbor repainted the kitchen pink, and then boom, boom, boom. It was a blend of profiler and robot.
People have always liked robots. You see it in Fritz Lang's Metropolis, or the fascination we all have for robots in Ridley Scott's Blade Runner in 1982, where the replicants are humanoid robots made of flesh and blood. It's an incredible thing to be potentially able to survive anything. It's the Terminator.
But unlike Terminator and all the human robots from pop culture, this isn't science fiction. Jason Bourne is anchored in reality. For Doug Liman, the CIA program had to be realistic.
But it also comes from a real place, because I know how we train soldiers, and I know how we train people to kill, and it requires a certain level of desensitization. Yeah, it's a form of brainwashing.
The director who succeeded Doug Liman after the first film, Paul Greengrass, reinforced the realism. A former journalist and documentary filmmaker, he didn't hesitate to draw from his past experience with investigative journalism.
It's not very well known, but in the 1980s, Paul Greengrass co-authored a book by an MI6 whistleblower, Peter Wright, called Spycatcher. Paul Greengrass wrote this book, but no one ever talks about it. So he was in that niche already in the 80s as a young journalist. He already displayed that interest in intelligence and spycraft. He's been on this track his whole life, moving from journalism to film direction.
The sensation of reality is created by a handheld camera that's constantly in motion, that seems permanently just a step behind the action.
When the characters punch each other, we feel it. That's his trademark in the second and third episodes. He incorporates a way of filming that's like reporting with a handheld cam. We are with the character. We follow him. When he jumps out of one building into another, we're afraid for him because we think he's going to smash his face in. We're there. We're on the alert. We're scared. And the camera shakes and moves and is unsure of itself. it makes us nervous and at the same time thrusts us into reality.
We believe it all the time. The realism is incredible. That's his trademark. It's a very distinctive trademark.
There's a scene in the first film that illustrates this. A simple car chase in Paris, generally a classic action movie scene. But Doug Liman's stroke of genius was to change one single ingredient that made all the difference. Use a teeny tiny car. When the French film crew received the work layout for this scene, they could hardly believe their eyes.
I remember the reaction of the stunt manager about the Mini. He was like, why the Mini? That's not going to be very exciting. But in the end, when I talk with people who aren't necessarily in the business and tell them I worked on Bourne, they say, oh yeah, the car chase with the Mini. There were no special effects. It was natural, organic.
It's not the movie where the car skids around the corner and just misses hitting something. This is the movie where we skid around the corner and we do hit the thing. And by the time the chase is done, the car is dented. Or by the time the fight is done, Matt Damon has a bruise. You know, that it's not, that's the defining tone for the action.
That kind of directing for our crew meant rapidity, handheld camera, shots that went every which way. It was a documentary style, but one with the logistics of 150 people on the set.
With this kind of renewed action and its complex, realistic protagonist, the Bourne saga even dared venture onto the turf of the world's most well-known spy.
The classic James Bond that I remember, you know, was a dapper English spy wearing a tuxedo, sipping a martini with a beautiful woman, and driving an Aston Martin. Whereas Jason Bourne, on the other hand, was gritty. He was street level. He was a true operative in the sense. He was in the streets. He was in the shadows. He wasn't wearing fancy clothes. He wasn't driving fancy cars. He wasn't seducing beautiful women.
Ironically, in 2002, the year Jason Bourne was born on screen, the 20th James Bond film was also released with the evocative title, Die Another Day.
I really like Pierce. I really like how he looks in a tuxedo, but that's the problem. He wears a tuxedo. And when you put Die Another Day up against the arrival of Jason Bourne, James Bond seems to suddenly age overnight. The media realized that right away.
Barbara Broccoli, who runs the organization now, she decided that they had to change Bond, that they were going into a dead end, and because of and she mentioned this specifically, because she said we need to make Bond more like Jason Bourne. We need him to be darker, to be more real, because after all, the films were more or less cartoon characters.
That was exactly when Pierce Brosnan got a call from production saying, listen, Pierce, that was your last James Bond.
The James Bond after that was Casino Royale, where there's more brutality. The actors are different, and for once when someone gets hit, they bleed. They get a bruise. You see their injuries. They say when they're hurt. If James is hurting, it's because Jason was hurting before.
But it's not just thrillers and action movies. that Jason Bourne took by storm. Even superhero films sought inspiration from the saga's codes.
He's such an obvious pop icon to the extent that when the Russo brothers came up with the concept for their second Captain America movie, The Winter Soldier, well, what did they do? They did Jason Bourne. All the Jason Bourne codes are respected down to the letter. America in the grips of incredible surveillance. You have a character, the Winter Soldier, who has no memory. He's an amnesiac. He's going to fight against Captain America, who's going to discover conspiracies and plots, and what's more, the Winter Soldier is a kind of robot. What we have is a real reinterpretation of the genre where the superhero movie jumps onto the coattails of the spy movie in the style of Doug Liman or Paul Greengrass. The spy movie a la Jason Bourne.
Confronted with his memory loss, sensitive, lost, and struggling with his own brutality, Jason Bourne is modern man. Constantly seeking a serenity he never finds.